Good afternoon. My name is Randal Dietrich. I'm the director of the Minnesota Military Museum here at Camp Ripley. Museum is just down the street, quarter mile. Have you all been to the museum at least once or twice, I hope? Well, we wanted to bring part of the museum to you today to talk about the centennial anniversary of the end of World War I. And the museum is always looking for ways to make history relevant, because history matters, and ways that we can connect with people and engage folks about the legacy of World War I is something that I got turned on to a number of years ago. And working with my colleague David Geister, who you'll hear from in just a minute, turned us on to this idea of what you see behind you. And what you see behind you is what we'll be talking about for the next hour, because there's a lot packed into the faces that you see behind you, as well as understanding what the inspiration was for the making of this 30-foot mural based upon historical precedent created by two French artists 100 years ago who were trying to find meaning of the war that was to end all wars, of course, and obviously did not. You've got 4.7 million Americans who served during the war, including 120,000 Minnesotans who were in the service. About half of that number, 60,000 or so, actually made it overseas, and more than 1,000 were killed in action, and many more actually died because of the flu, which is something we'll talk about briefly as well. But an equally compelling part of the story is how a number of things came together besides the campaign, the fighting itself, to really make the war, in many ways, the making of modern America. You can find in the faces behind me, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Understand that the Civil War wasn't so far removed from World War I. You've got Arthur MacArthur, who was, of course, a Civil War hero, but also Douglas MacArthur's father. You have Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, as he actually has memories of the Civil War when he was a young man. He talks about in his biography. He remembers the Civil War. Wilson has talked about in his biography the fact that he remembers seeing Lee's surrender. So not so far removed from the Civil War was World War I. And in this case, you even had European observers who were in America at the time observing how things were unfolding militarily for the North and South. And what you saw with the siege of Richmond at the end of the war is going to kind of portend what we see with the outbreak of World War I. And with that, also the understanding that at least in Europe, it was a different world back then. The Queen Victoria, the Queen of England, is actually, of course, the eldest grandson of Queen Victoria, is the Kaiser. You have relations and cousins that are intertwined. You have Tsar Nicholas and the Kaiser and King George all being cousins. So as war broke out, in many ways, it was almost a family feud in Europe. You weren't supposed to be doing this. They relied upon marriage for a number of years to keep these alliances that knit Europe together to prevent war. And when war broke out, people couldn't quite believe it. And what happened with that was, of course, destruction. Europe is at war for almost 4 years by the time the Americans set foot and get involved. Germany had the plan at the outbreak of war in 1914 to win the war in about 1,000 hours. 40 days or so, the Schlieffen Plan. So this was supposed to be a quick war in the minds of some, and it drags on and on and on, and all throughout. Of course, the Americans are slow to get involved for perhaps good reasons, but it's certainly hotly debated here at home. But millions of casualties result, starting in 1914. And if anything, you need to keep in mind that if there ever was kind of a shock and awe kind of campaign, I would argue that World War I was a shock and awe kind of experience for people. You have trench warfare. When that fighting breaks down after the first 40 days or so of fighting, people go below ground, below grade to survive the machine gun fire and other things, and this stalemate ensues in 1915. That carries over to 1916, into 1917, and the lines just don't move, and the war just doesn't end. And what that inspires is a lot of mother of invention kinds of thinking. There's a need to try to overcome this stalemate. So all kinds of things are invented for the first time. You have gas warfare, again, shock and awe, never seen before. And as deadly as it is, certainly the psychological warfare that's being launched with gas warfare is traumatic and something we'd never seen before. So imagine that experience for troops for the first time. You have airplanes. Wright brothers fly in 1903. The war breaks out in 1914, so a little over a decade after we invented flight, You have airplanes being used in aerial bombardments. You have zeppelins flying over London, dropping bombs on people with the idea of total warfare for the first time. You think you're far removed from the front lines, but you're not. Tanks make their appearance for the first time. Again, imagine the experience of seeing more ominous, maybe tanks than these, some British tanks perhaps, and coming over slowly but creeping at you and fully armored. Again, something the world had never seen before, because all these inventions are a result of the stalemate that the sides are facing on the Western Front and the Eastern Front, for that matter. Artillery, for all the death and destruction that was brought by World War I, artillery is by far the deadliest. You have, up until that time, the very kind of patriotic, proud charge into the other line and give your life heroically, pull on your white gloves and advance into the other side, is a way of dying for your country, which was part of the European experience leading up to World War I. But imagine the idea of being denied the opportunity to die for your country in that way when artillery launched at you from miles away lands on a group and obliterates them. It undermines the whole psychology of what it is to wage war in Europe. All of that gets undermined with all these advances the world is seeing for the first time. Barbed wire, the dangers are seemingly everywhere, of course, makes its appearance and is heavily used across the Western Front and in the trenches. And just as you think that, again, the dangers are essentially all around you, near the end of the war, when desertions are starting to set in on both sides, and we start to send American troops overseas and join the Allies in the trenches. You have the outbreak of the Spanish flu, and you have soldiers carrying that overseas and coming together in cantonment camps, on ships, on trains, with the advice of many to stop doing this. But the war effort, the demand for men on the front lines, as Germany is concentrating their forces after the fall of Russia and the Russian Revolution, there's this impulse to send men overseas and to rally for the war cause and buy war bonds. And the whole time that you have these gatherings, these congregating of people, what you're doing is spreading the flu. So as deadly as the war is, the flu ends up being much more deadly than the war itself. And when the war ends, those troops go home, they come back to the United States, they return to India and Africa. There's 135 countries that fight in the war. So what we do is we bring everyone together, and then we send them all home when the war eventually is over, and all that does is spread that pandemic worldwide. And if there's an estimate after the war's end that maybe 20 million people died because of the flu, more recent, more scientific efforts since then suggest that number is closer to 80 million. So it's a deadly time for the flu, and it's also a time of shock and awe that the world had never seen these things before. So how do you make sense of all that loss? Europe is, at least geographically, unrecognizable to what it might have looked like before the war. Empires vanish. New countries are created. How does the world start to make sense of this war that was, at some point, suggested to end all future wars? Was a question that was posed by many. Here domestically, understand that there was racial unrest. 1968 is a year that we hear a lot about, and many of us lived through. A year of assassinations, unrest, protest. 1919 was much like that, if not worse, when it comes to race relations in the country. Women are fighting for suffrage at the same time the war is being fought. So all these different experiences are coming together in this crucible of war and changing the world and making modern America, and that's what we have endeavored to show you in the mural behind us, painted by David Geister. Of course, this man is at the center of a lot of it. He runs for re-election, Wilson, in 1916 on the promise or suggestion, the slogan that he kept us out of war, and he had. Of course, in Minnesota, there's no hurry to go and join the fight. Many people living in Minnesota at the time had not so long ago left Europe just for this reason. They were looking for a new life. Their last names are Dietrich. They're German. They don't want to go back and fight their cousins, their friends, their neighbors. And so there's a resistance here at home to getting involved in the fight in the first place. But eventually Wilson gives in when all the war loans that have been made to the Allies start to become jeopardized, when you see France and England flailing and potentially losing. and there's little prospect of being paid back for those loans, primarily made by private financiers, if the Allies lose. You have the Zimmermann telegram being delivered to Mexico from Germany. You have the sinking of the Lusitania a couple of years earlier. You have the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare as a last-ditch effort the Germans make to try to keep the Americans from reaching the front line or providing more aid to the Allies. So all those things together set Wilson on a path of declaring war. And once he declared war, he was all in. Preparedness was the watchword of the time. And really, what Wilson did domestically and what he did internationally is phenomenal and worthy of much further analysis and investigation. But Wilson is at the heart of this, and France is trying to find a way to commemorate the losses that they incurred. France was obliterated, decimated in many ways. They got hammered. And what do you do to try to find meaning to that? Was a question that was posed throughout, of course, and two French artists decided to take an approach that you might expect from the French in some ways, which was to create a painting. And Wilson appears in that painting, and others appear in the painting. Of course, the idea when war ends is you want to be triumphal. The victors get to write the history and also maybe paint the history that starts to suggest that this is a stairway of heroes. Two French artists create this stairway of heroes depicting the Allies that fought on behalf of France and England for the war effort. And they coincidentally started this painting when the war broke out in 1914 and continued to paint. And they painted and they painted. And when they were done, they had 5,000 figures depicted in this painting. And the painting grew. And the painting was 47 feet high, which is about as high as this room is, and it's 400 feet in length, which is the size of this room doubled. So as high as this room is, as twice as wide is the Panthéon de la Guerre, which was the French effort to commemorate the war. This painting was completed. It was then presented to millions of students around France to come and see it in a building that was, of course, the Panthéon. And so millions of students were invited to come and see these 5,000 heroic figures that gave their lives and fought on behalf of France in the war. It's a way of commemorating, finding meaning for the loss of millions. Like lots of good ideas, it eventually comes across the pond and appears in the United States and is shown at the World's Fair and other locations from east to west. It's much like the Gettysburg Cyclorama, if you've seen that. It's kind of that same feel and presented in the same way. But what happens? This grand idea of this important painting that is captivating in many ways is less captivating when you view it in context. The context being the Great Depression, the context being Hitler on the rise, the invasion of Poland. So by 1940, you've already got Poland and Hitler. And so the world is changing very, very quickly, and technology is changing. And the idea of this painting becomes less important when you're fighting to find work or food or survival. And so this painting eventually falls on hard times and is essentially forgotten as the world marches to war once again. At some point, it actually ends up in Philadelphia, rolled up on a loading dock and forgotten. At that time, the World War One Museum in Kansas City, anybody been there? By all means, you should go to 2 museums and find out a lot more about World War I because it's well worth the trip. The first one is just down the road at the museum, because there's a fantastic World War I exhibit you should check out even today, if not this weekend, because we are open on Veterans Day. And if not there, continue further south to Kansas City to the National World War I Museum and Memorial. Because Daniel McMorris, at the time back in the 1950s, wrote a letter, made an inquiry to the owner of this decrepit, this is a rolled up depiction, so that the painting has been rolled up and is now being crane lifted into a boxcar, essentially. So it's rotting away. Daniel McMorris writes a letter to this Philadelphia restaurateur who happens to be a World War I veteran, or more specifically, a German World War I veteran, and he agrees to essentially give it to the World War I Museum in Kansas City. However, when it's discovered and brought to Kansas City, it's so decrepit that it can't be saved. And so Daniel McMorris goes about what you see here, which is cutting up that 400-foot painting, saving what he can, reconfiguring parts of it, giving some parts to friends and donors, throwing other parts into the dumpster, and moving on. What results is a very different depiction than what you saw a few minutes ago, which is about 7% of the Pantheon de la Guerre, which currently is on view, as you see here, at the World War I Museum in Kansas City. But this is Cold War Kansas City in the 1950s. And what Dana McMorris and the country is trying to, I think, suggest, show, is a different kind of American presence. After the war, before the war, the centers of power in the world, Paris, Berlin, London. After the war, of course, that changes. It shifts. Moscow becomes a sphere of influence. Rise of communism, fall of Russia, the Russian Revolution. The financial capital of the world moves away from Europe to New York City and DC, and that doesn't change. And so what you see here is an idea of how art maybe suggests or represents or reinterprets history, because here you have a different representation. Here, the Americans are front and center. Those two French artists that started the painting, as David will attest to in just a minute, composition is an important part of any painting. Those French artists are painting for years, adding those allies in this composition that's 400 feet long. It gets complicated when late into the war, 1917, all of a sudden the Americans show up and the question is asked, where do we put the Americans in this composition? So those two French artists start painting over and making room for the Americans, marching in at the last minute to maybe save the day. That's suggested here. Again, Wilson was at the center of that. And that painting that you see is still at Kansas City. And that painting and Kansas City was important in my understanding of the war and informed my thinking years ago. And as we were trying to endeavor to find a way to make history relevant, World War I relevant, the idea came about and was discussed that let's do something at least, kind of in the footsteps of those people. So if you take the original painting, we then approached David Geister and commissioned him to paint a new Wilson and to build upon that, carry that symbol forward into this painting you see behind me and expand on it. And what you see here is on permanent display at the library just down the street. We'll be bringing it to the Twin Cities to share at a number of places to commemorate the war this weekend, which is why we're here now, hoping that you'll join us at the museum on Sunday for a tolling of the bells, which is happening nationwide at 11 a.m. We're also open on Monday, which is the national holiday of Veterans Day. But as we did more research into World War I, you can make the suggestion, and I think compellingly so, that it is the making of modern America, especially when you dig into the histories of those people represented behind me and in David's mural. Legacy and leadership. Who are some of the kind of military figures depicted here? You got Pershing and George Patton. Patton appeals to Pershing as he's on the Mexican border, as he's about to launch his punitive expeditions, and he's eager, desperate to join the fight and join Pershing. And this is the first time that those two meet in Mexico on that punitive expedition. You got George Marshall and Lesley McNair, two more obviously important figures in World War II, naturally, but here they are during the World War I era. And they actually are cabin mates on their way across the pond to Europe. They share a cabin on the ocean liner. So they meet early on, and of course their legacies stretch well into World War II and beyond, with the Marshall Plan following World War II. And these are all figures that had a place in World War I and go on and have a prominent role in really the shaping of modern America. You got Eisenhower and George Patton again. Eisenhower never does get overseas. He's desperate to get in the fight. He can't get over. He's actually stationed in Gettysburg for a while, looking at tank tactics and warfare, training other officers to go overseas, but unfortunately Eisenhower doesn't make it overseas to fight. Patton does, but the two of them meet up in 1919 and spend the year together exploring tank tactics and their studies. So already these historic figures that you see and hear about so much in World War II and its aftermath with Eisenhower and his presidency meet early on in World War One, and what starts to happen is this web of these lives start to shape together and becomes this tapestry that you see that really is part of the world that we live in now is based upon these individuals. And then other lesser known ones. On the left, Harry Commemoration, who's one of my favorites. David and I talk about kind of who our favorite individuals depicted here. Harry's one of mine. Harry served in the war, wasn't a war hero, wasn't a Patton or MacArthur or Douglas by any means, but he is very important because he's one of those people that starts after World War II, based upon his World War I experience, to draft the GI Bill. So as you look at these kind of citizen soldiers and the idea of what they do after the war, what we have here is a representation of people that do an awful lot to advance the cause. Edwin Hubble is the gentleman on the right, scientific advances, of course. You've got Ray Kroc of the McDonald's famous depicted here. Walt Disney makes the painting. So what you have are a number of people that together kind of make the world that we recognize today. And many of them were in the service, some prominently, some not prominently, but what underscores their experience is that service in the war, and what perhaps they learned as a result of that continues to inform their thinking. Truman is a great example of that, of course, being in the artillery, but being president, his decision to end World War II in some ways is based upon his World War I experience. And Ellard Walsh, of course, recognized here, and the father of the kind of National Guard is another figure we added just recently, as David's been kind of feverishly working to finish the painting. You can't have a painting here at Camp Ripley without Mr. Walsh making an appearance. And as we try to have figures that have historical importance on some level, he's deservingly there. So it's been that process. So as much as the idea was based upon seeing that original Pantheon de la Guerre and looking at the legacy of the war, the idea that you want to do it only takes you far enough where you can find somebody to help you execute it. And here are two people that do just that. Diane is on the right. Diane is our librarian. Our library at the museum opened this spring and has 15,000 books about military history. And this is where, once the weekend is over, this mural will be returned to the library and permanently installed there, as well as the 15,000 books that are available to everybody to check out. Of those 15,000, more than 600 are about World War I. So if you want to dig deeper into World War I or some of the lives of these people depicted here, the library, I would suggest, is the place to do so. But the idea that I wanted to have a painting gets me only as far as having the idea of doing the painting. And what you need are a talented artist to step forward and paint the canvas and figure out how to make that concept a reality. And in that case, I've turned to David Geister, who is a veteran himself and seemed to be the perfect fit to help us do what we've endeavored to do here, which again is somewhat in the footsteps of those French artists, trying to find relevance to it by suggesting that the people here, if you dig deeper into them, you do find an awful lot of things that we recognize today that can be attributed to their life then. And in that way, it's a great tool for us to engage school groups that come through the museum and talk about those lives that are depicted here and how that World War I experience, whether they're soldiers or activists or authors or athletes, soldiers or statesmen, they're all represented here. And it's a great way for us to start the process of finding relevance into this war that seems in many ways to be far removed. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you find that it's not removed at all. It's something that we live with every single day as we drive up and down the interstate highway system and drive past McDonald's, look at the National Guard installations across the country. That's all represented. Go to the movies, go to the ball games, look at the world today. Find these folks and you will find the origins of our world and our country. So to make it all real, David Geister is the guy who helped make it all real. David, tell us more.
Wow. Okay. Going to be kind of hard to beat Randal's energy and delivery, but we'll see what I can do here. Well, this was a unique opportunity. that as somebody who has considered himself a history painter for much of his life, has often wondered, when do I get a chance to work on a large canvas? And Randal came knocking. We'd already worked on a few projects, and I almost immediately said yes. And so this is what resulted. I'd like to say it's done.
It's done.
It's more or less done. There will always be things I would like to fine tune and perhaps improve upon, but you reach a point where you have to just move on and do something else. And for our stated objectives, which was essentially 100 plus individuals from the First World War era who helped make modern America, I think we succeeded in that. The entire process from start to finish, which is to say Randal's first conception of this type of project to where we are today, is just about 3 years. I'd say give or take a few weeks perhaps. And so how do you even talk about it? Well, I do know that when we first sat down at the table in my home and had this conversation, I was thinking, what would the point of view be? Are we going to focus more on the military aspect of affairs? And as a veteran and as a military history enthusiast, that was my inclination. I'm happy to say, quite frankly, that no, the vision was for something much greater than that, to help put the military experience in a greater context. But what point of view? I try to be neutral as a history painter. I don't think it's entirely possible to be neutral in anything. We all have inherent biases. There's just no way around that. It's just a fact of life. But one thing we did try to do was to include as diverse a cast as possible. Now, those character choices, thankfully, were not ones that I had to make, or we would still be looking at blank canvases right now. Ask my wife, anytime we go out to eat or decide what movie to watch, it's just a painful, slogging process because I want it all. I want it all. But luckily, historians, Randal, a number of individuals at the Minnesota Historical Society and various other agencies chimed in. And originally, the laundry list of characters was much larger. What do you think, maybe 200 names? Great names. They did not all make the cut, of course, for a variety of reasons. And I'm glad they didn't, because there's no way I could have shoehorned that many characters in here. But that decision was largely made for me. And let me just show you. Of course, you've got the real thing there in front of you. This is how it looked about a year and a half ago, down in the bowels of the earth, the Minnesota History Center, which was an interesting place to start painting a picture. But it worked out fine. I made a lot of friends with the staff and the cleaning crew down there for about 6 months or more, and gradually tried laying everything out. I drew in a grid just to give me something to build on, and then started to eventually add more characters over top of what was really just an initial rough lay-in. And that cast of characters, as we've already talked about, evolved over time. And they were somewhat initially placed into categories that have slightly modified since then, but essentially you have the war. I think that's fairly obvious. I will say, as a key to those who might be interested, Walt Disney is the one in the reddish-brown vest, all right? Everybody to this side of Disney is somebody who didn't get overseas during the war itself. Disney sort of bridges that gap. He got there right after the armistice, okay? So if you're still standing on the walkway and it's not destroyed, you didn't make it overseas during the war, all right? And then what I originally was calling the political realm or the political scene, which is sort of how we get into and out of the war. And then the home front, which I think is pretty straightforward. You'll notice the walkway is under construction here, whereas it's basically been destroyed by the time we get to the war. And those characters, well, Randal's already mentioned them. I'm just going to restate a couple. George Leach, commander of the 151st. There's our strong Minnesota connection. Ellard Walsh, once again, father of the National Guard. These were characters that were added within the last, 4 months, I believe, which involved a bit of painting out of old faces, putting in new faces, trying to match colors as best as possible after more than a year of having the original layer of paint dry. Not an easy thing to do, but I tried my best. Lesley McNair, killed in the Second World War. Frank Kellogg, Minnesotan, helps try to win the peace after the war, basically. Sports characters like Charles Chief Bender, and inventors like Frederick Jones. All right. Two men of color, significant, and most of us don't know their name at this point in time. The Mayo brothers, Charles and William. You may be interested to know that before we put the Mayo brothers in, that space was occupied by America's favorite thug, Al Capone. I think we've probably got a better deal now, although to be honest, the storytelling possibilities were endless when we had Al Capone over there. But it's okay. So how did we do it? How did I do it? Well, I'm just going to take a brief moment because we have in the room here really a phenomenal painter, Charles Kapsner. And Charles is the real thing, as we say. Charles is classically trained and he does magnificent work, old school. Is that probably a good way to put it? In fact, would you stand up for just a moment? If you haven't met Charles Kapsner, he's somebody you should know. Has anybody seen the work that Charles did for what's the hall called at the cemetery? The committal hall, just down the road. Has anybody seen the paintings that he's done there? They're magnificent. One for each of the branches of service, and you have one left to go. That'll be finished next year. They're absolutely beautiful, and there's a level of finish there that I drool when I look at them. And I know for a fact that Charles works old school because I had the privilege of modeling for some of the characters, and we're talking about standing in place while the master draws you very carefully. I could not do that with this piece. Technically, it's beyond my ability to do a piece on this scale that old school way, so I had to rely upon modern technology, which is often the case. As an illustrator, I live and die by my phone, which I never use as a phone and use as a camera all the time, and the ability to quickly shoot references of people in costume. So, two friends dressed in reproduction World War I uniforms posing for any number of characters that you do see in the painting. I would beg, borrow, and steal body parts. So I felt like, Frankenstein putting together a monster. I'd take somebody's hand from this and the head from that and mash them together and hope that my vague understanding of human anatomy would still sort of come through and win in the end. In fact, my friend Andy in the foreground there is posing as probably one of my favorite characters, Joseph Oklahomby, right over here. And we'll talk a little more about Joseph later. But I would use photos of family members, friends, models for most of the characters. In a few instances, I was able to locate a photograph of the historic individual from the exact angle, dressed in the correct clothing, and in maybe 2 occasions, the light was coming from the correct direction. The perspective is often a bit funny. Some of these characters would be viewed from slightly lower, some slightly higher, and I had to just sort of live with that. Here's our dear friend Mary posing as what will become Amelia Earhart. And Amelia Earhart in this case is made up of about 4 or 5 different references, all shoehorned together. And then of course when I started putting paint on the canvas, it headed in another whole direction anyhow. The references really only get me to a certain point, and then I have to start to do something with them. And I end up throwing a lot of that out and just going with what seems to make the most sense, given the time and whatever constraints there might be. A lot of research was involved here, a lot of research. It helped that I was at the Minnesota History Center, and quite frankly, it helped that we had, probably more than anything else, the Minnesota Military Museum to really dig in and show us what does that badge look like? What does this weapon look like? Those are questions that need answering, particularly if you're doing a history painting. There's certainly room for artistic interpretation and artistic license, but not when it comes to the buttons, the machine guns. You know, those are important details. They're a part of that time. They're a part of who those people were. And as a history painter, I feel that my job is to, as much as possible, tell the truth, so that somebody who looks at my painting perhaps can take a certain amount of solace, if you will, in the fact that I've done my best to try to share, you know, the truth, if, at least insofar as the uniforms, the hairstyles, and those details go. Those French artists, those two main French artists who started the original Panthéon de la Guerre, ultimately had about 20 other main artists help them, I believe. I had help in a variety of forms. I estimate conservatively 250 visitors to the History Center and the library just down the road. Maybe closer to 300 helped me paint this. And some of it actually was genuinely helpful, and I'll show you that in a moment. But this was a decision made early on that I warmed to, because it seemed to me that it was a missed opportunity not to let people who want to do so, a missed opportunity not to let them be part of the history of the creation of the painting, which in turn ties them to the actual historic event itself. And nothing gives me greater pleasure than imagining a scene 50 years down the road, coming this Sunday, right? How long be gone? I fear we'll all be gone by then. But my hope is that one of these children will show up at the library or wherever the painting is at that point. They'll be 60 years old and they say, you know, when I was a 10-year-old, this goofy guy with a ponytail handed me a brush and told me to put a pebble next to Walt Disney's boot. And so that's a way of sort of extending the life of this painting, and hopefully an understanding of the war itself and its impact far into the future, far beyond my experience with it. Of course, this would not have gotten done if it hadn't been for my dear wife, my able assistant, who went from posing and stitching things together and providing me in the manner to which I've become accustomed, to actually helping out and putting in a lot of paint. A lot of the stonework you see up here was my wife's handiwork as we were getting down to the wire. So I'd be lost without her. And then, of course, I had a young gentleman, Nick, who he was my apprentice for a couple of months in the summer when I worked on this. And I had every intention of perhaps having to go over and touch up a lot of what he did, because he'd never really painted anything like this before. But that ambulance you see there, it was almost entirely painted by Nick under my direction. And he did it well enough that I never really felt the need to go back and do anything to it. So this was another way of sort of connecting somebody to this moment in time, as well as the First World War. And I think he enjoyed the process. I enjoyed having him there. We got to talk shop the whole time. So yes, I borrowed Wilson's figure, his pose specifically, and a bit of the drapery of the flag, and the fact that in the original Pantheon, he's standing next to a monument of some type. That for me was the basis of where we would start. I wanted a central element that we could sort of expand out from to left and right. This cast of characters is probably my favorite cluster in the entire piece. And the fact that a number of them are soldiers of color is not a coincidence. It seemed to me that I would be doing a great injustice if I simply repeated what had always been done before, which was to relegate soldiers of color, be they Native American, African American, Asian American, to a subsidiary role. It's been done way too often, and the picture's packed full of the type of characters we normally expect to see. And quite frankly, the stories are just very compelling. So the gentleman seated in the immediate foreground is Joseph Oklahoma of the Choctaw Nation. Here's a man who, after serving honorably in the most horrific conditions, came home to a country where he still was not allowed to vote. So I tried to feature him somewhat prominently. And next to him is a man that we added just a few months ago who I always wanted to, and I was really glad that we were able to do so. That's Henry Johnson, one of the Harlem Hellfighters. These were African American soldiers who, when they arrived overseas, could not be put in the front lines next to white regiments because of the political fallout that the president and the generals would face back home. And there were a lot of other reasons too, but the end result is that they essentially served under French command for a while, hence the French helmet and the French gear. That man's holding a bolo knife in his hand. If you get a chance, I encourage you to come up and look at the paintings closely when we're done. And he put that through a German helmet and into the man that was wearing that helmet at one point in battle, and was horribly wounded in some of the most intense fighting you could imagine. He's in the foreground, and those are the only two seated characters, and there's a reason for that. My original idea was to have a white soldier, a black soldier, and a Native American soldier all seated, showing a sense of equality in their experience. These would have been three men who had been to hell more than probably anybody else in the picture. In the end, the other character, we simply didn't need him, quite frankly, and we're running out of room. But the fact that these two are seated, to me, actually was sort of a way of honoring them, setting them slightly apart from the rest of the cast. And up in the background, we have James Reese Europe. He's the one standing there in the cloak with the soft cap on. And it's probably hard to tell, but he's holding his baton in his hand. He's the bandmaster of the Harlem Hellfighters, and he brought jazz to Europe as much as anybody else. Amazing legacy. Unfortunately, he did not survive much beyond the end of the war. And then there's a character in there who I have a fondness for, Toki Slocum. Perhaps a bit hard to make out. Here's a man who was brought to the United States from Japan by his father. And due to the racism they faced, the father ended up leaving, apparently. And Toki Slocum was given up for adoption to a family in Minot, North Dakota. So he was raised as Toki Slocum. I do not remember his original last name. He has a Minnesota connection. He went to the University of Minnesota here. The war breaks out. He's not a citizen. He does not have to go fight, but he chooses to do so and serves honorably. He becomes a sergeant major. He's gassed in a German attack. He comes home, and what was offered to him as a possibility, as a track to citizenship, is denied because of his Asian heritage. There are laws in the book dating to the 19th century that simply would not allow that. So he spends quite some time and a lot of effort in getting that overturned. And in the end, the American Legion, even I believe, is one of the organizations that stepped forward to help in that process. And Toki received the pen that President Franklin Roosevelt, now this is years after the First World War, signed, the pen that Roosevelt used to sign new laws into effect. So Toki did in fact become an American citizen, and as a result of his efforts, hundreds and hundreds of other Japanese American, Asian American veterans of the Great War became American citizens as a result of their service. But of course, the irony is in 1942, where do we find him? He's Japanese. He's living in the West Coast. He's in an internment camp. It's a complicated story, to say the least. And I'm not suggesting that the individual I'm going to point out is a villain, because he's not. But just to show you how we all have inherent qualities, good, bad, and otherwise, and they overlap and they affect the people around us. This here is John McCloy, who was an artillery captain in 1918. But by 1941-42, he's part of the Roosevelt administration. He's the one who has to implement the internment camp process. And so, in a way, he's responsible for Toki Slocum and his family and other Japanese people being put in the internment camps. It's more complicated than all that. Randal and I like to have a go-around about just about this time.
That's not all the story, but
well,
continue.
It's not all the story, is it?
It is not.
Because people are complicated. And hopefully we can talk about it more if there's time and energy afterwards. This just points to the fact that you can go any number of directions with this work based partly on this diverse cast of characters. They take us all over the place. Geographically, politically, you name it. They run the whole gamut. Another grouping that I rather enjoy talking about, we have Harry Truman. He's the captain of artillery up there on his horse. You can see a section of guns coming down the road behind him. Horse drawn, obviously. In the immediate foreground, to this side, we have General Pershing, who is almost incidental in this particular grouping right here in the part I'm talking about. He's obviously very important because this is his army. But the man behind him is George Marshall, the one who is almost directly in front of the arm of Harry Truman. George Marshall will get to know Truman during the Second World War because Truman eventually becomes his commander-in-chief. And to the other side, we have Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur will certainly get to know Truman during the Second World War and certainly during the Korean War when Truman ends up firing MacArthur. So I'm trying to imagine there's a cautionary tale there, about how you maybe treat somebody when they're beneath you. It doesn't quite work out that way, but this was a way to create, from an artistic standpoint, it's just something that would break up this line here, if you will, and by placing these two characters right there, create a story, one of many stories, and that happens all throughout the piece. There are so many connections. You've got the foundation. Whoever saw a movie made by United Artists once upon a time, all right? There they are. Those are the folks, who made United Artists. I mean, it just goes on and on and on like that. There's various symbology, if you will, themes. When we first conceived this whole idea, I thought, how in the world am I going to stretch 100 characters out? Well, we're not going to put them on one big canvas because it's logistically going to be impossible for us to haul around if we have to move it anywhere. And so I hit upon the simple solution of doing 3 separate canvases, which in turn then gave us the possibility for 3 different themes. And even though we have added additional characters that slightly break up that theme, they're still inherently there. The war to one side, the political scene to the middle, the home front, and the backgrounds largely telegraph where we are and what's happening there. The home front is fairly lush, We've got destruction on the other side. There's the themes of changing technology. Those horses hauling guns down the road right past a French tank, all right? So we really see the change in technology that's happening at the time. Talking about, once again, the symbolism on the home front. You've got a threshing scene. You've got smoke belching out from the tractor. You've got what is possibly a mail plane or a barnstormer going over. Telephone poles upright. So there's a sense of bounty and lushness and industry, if you will, in a relatively serene landscape. And I intentionally set it up so that there would be visual contrasts and comparisons there. So the smoke here from what is probably a downed German plane. The fields are destroyed. Everything's denuded. The only thing that lives in the landscape are the horses and the humans. And this plane is most certainly not a mail carrier. This plane is being piloted by Eugene Bullard, who is an African-American gentleman who was serving in the French service, which in a sense sort of makes him one of our first fighter pilots because he was doing this before the Americans got into the war. So that's the plane that he was flying in French service. While I was painting, about halfway through the process, a visitor remarked, "It sure would be nice if you could put in the unknown soldier." And I didn't say it out loud, but my thought was, well, how in the devil do you paint the portrait of somebody that we don't know? And moments later, I was looking at the picture a little bit farther back, and I realized I had this open archway with just a bunch of rubble in it. And it occurred to me that I had a possible way to introduce the unknown soldier. By putting a soldier there far enough back that the shadow from the archway might be cast on his upper body, we never would have to see the face. So we really can't tell who he is. So he's my stand-in for the unknown soldier. And that was serendipity. Throughout the whole process, I tried to keep myself open to what I was hearing from people. I second-guessed myself continually. Do we have time for me to continue in one little? Here's a perfect example. I don't show it necessarily up here. This woman is another one of my favorite characters. This is Anna Coleman Ladd. She was a sculptor, an American sculptor living in Paris during the war. And when she saw those French and later American soldiers coming back to the front with these horribly ruined faces, missing eyes and lower jaws and whatnot, she realized that as a sculptor she could possibly make their lives somewhat more bearable. And so she would bring these men in, and with her team they would cast this individual's face, this horribly ruined face. And then using photographs of this person before the war, or perhaps by bringing in a brother who looked a lot like him, she would resculpt the portions of the face in clay. These were then cast in very thin bronze, copper, I used to know this, copper, thank you. And then painted in flesh tones to try to match the person's complexion. And then you'd wear it usually with spectacles or something to hold it in place. Well, the point is, a significant individual, and this was a way to speak towards the horror of the war without possibly showing it. I originally had her holding one of these masks, and unfortunately, people, rightfully so, could not understand what she was doing. She's holding a flesh-colored face in her hand, part of a face, and it was too odd. So I removed it and I put in a white plaster cast of a man's face. That also simply did not apparently telegraph very well. My other concern is there was this big white blob over here towards the edge of the canvas, and to me it was visually a little distracting. And so at the end I wimped out, painted that out, gave her a new set of hands and 2 sculpting tools, and I would give anything to go back to that earlier incarnation, because I think even though it was odd, it was an attention getter, and it sort of hinted at the reality of that war more than those 2 little pieces of wood. So, last but not least, I wanted to suggest that the First World War is just the start, the start of something big, and it's not going to end. And so I thought about it for a moment and realized, well, obviously, the children at the time are the ones who have to go marching off to fight the Second World War. And they'll be led by some of the junior officers in this war. So I hit upon the idea of having a handful of children heading down a road past this White House. This house, incidentally, is the one that Harry Truman was living at when the war broke out. So it's down in Missouri. That places us in Missouri. As does what may or may not be Kansas City. Mm-hmm. The depot is very similar to the one in Kansas City. But these children are heading down the road towards some gathering storm clouds. And as they do so, they're marching past their great-grandfather, who's dressed in an old blue uniform with his long white beard, sitting on the steps. So he's probably a Civil War veteran. And this way I was able to hit upon 3 conflicts at the same time: the Civil War, the First World War, and the coming Second World War, and to show that they really all do link together. You cannot take any of these moments in history and isolate them. Mm-hmm. This thing always leads to that, and it's that whole idea of the unintended consequences. Best intentions do not always play out the way we want them to. And I have mixed feelings now, but those are my grandchildren. Those are our grandchildren in there. You wouldn't necessarily know that by looking at them, but we had them pose, which is a way of getting our family into it. But if I think too much about the symbolism, it scares the hell out of me. And that is all I have to say about that. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm often asked, who did you want to put in that you couldn't? And the truth is, there are tons of them, But purely more for the fun of it, I wanted to include this individual. Okay. This is a man named Marian C Cooper, who flew and fought in the skies over Europe for the Americans during the First World War. And he couldn't get enough of it, so when that ended, he helped the Poles fighting against the Russians, which is why he's wearing a Polish uniform here. And then he came back to the States and did what he's known for now, which is making movies. And it's no surprise that you see biplanes in King Kong. So Marian C Cooper helped bring about a movie that, to me, as a total nerd, I've always been in love with. I'm a monster kid on the inside. I'm 12 years old. I play with toy soldiers and I watch monster movies, and my wife just shakes her head and says, oh, okay, what did I do? Randal has something that he would like to perhaps share, or not. How about that?
Yeah, and also just pointing out, we had, the whole idea was that this is supposed to start conversations with
Are we going to
people.
talk about John McCloy?
We can talk about John.
All right.
Well, we can talk about two people, just in closing at least. It
Sure.
is to start conversations, right? To ask who's at that picture and why did you include him or why not, and that list of 200, which could be, everybody could have their own list, and that's kind of fun. And give us some time because we're drafting, we've got bios that we're publishing on all these people. But the kind of the criteria that we used in defining who's eligible to be on this list is folks that were either shaped or shaped by World War I. So many names you might throw out are too young because they just are, because they weren't part of this era. But that was kind of the idea, was shaped or shaped by. So even though you can't see it because this big crazy podium is blocking you, but you've got a young man down here as well who's holding a magazine, a periodical, talking about aviation, because Charles Lindbergh at the time was too young to be in the war. He's an adolescent. He's not going to be in the fight. But again, you've got, much like David is informed by what he's seeing in the media, here you have a Lindbergh who's reading about the escapades of these dogfighters and these aces in World War I, and that starts his mind thinking. And we know here what that leads to. So the idea that these are people that were shaped by the war or helped shape it itself, and that's kind of how he came up with this grouping of people. That's imperfect for sure, but also is great for storytelling. Because John McCloy, you're right, is one of those complicated characters.
Absolutely.
I got turned on to John McCloy only in that the Black Tom explosion during World War I happens on the East Coast. It's an act of war by the Germans in destroying these munition supplies in New York. And for the longest, when it happens, because of just how traumatic it was, it's a little bit brushed under the rug because we're trying to avoid escalating things. So Black Tom is this explosion. There are people that are trying to prove the Germans are responsible for the Black Tom explosion for years and years afterwards. They go to court to try to create the sense that Germany was behind this, and that drags on for literally decades. And John McCloy is one of those people that revives it and finally brings about a court resolution which holds Germany responsible for that attack. He's a lawyer, and he dedicates years of his life to proving that.
That's right.
Unfortunately, it takes so many years that at that point, World War II was already upon us. But he's one of those people that was trying to prove German involvement and this act of terrorism in New York City.
That's right.
And that's another part of John McCloy's story, and part of the Warren Commission. So
that's right. Yeah,
his
the
story
1960s, part of the Warren Commission.
Is just a long.
He's a
horizon.
fascinating character. He's complex, like all of us. He's complex.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that, like all the great history paintings of the past, this needs to go through a period where it's rolled up and either put in a boiler room or some barn for about 50 years, suffer damage, and then just before the sesquicentennial, somebody will bring it back to life and they'll say, who was this guy that did this thing? And what's the deal with John McCloy?
Right.
That's that, so. All right, I'm going to stop talking now.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.